Hmm. Hello, good morning. For those of you who are tracking these on a daily basis, I missed yesterday, so this is yesterday's video. So I've missed a total of 3 so far. Still going to do a total of 100 to get to the end, but yeah, so it is one day off here. So since yesterday, I've been having a discussion online. Okay, I'd have to go back and review exactly how we got here, but one place that we're bumping into is this weird philosophical space of, do we agree in reductionist materialism as a philosophical framework? It's very heady in an important way. I think I understand the key place of disagreement between us. But it's been bringing to mind a point that I've made through a lot of these videos. And so what I want to do is try to create a video that is about this piece. This is a little bit like, here's a very basic move that is really essential to the kind of work that I do and for seeing the things that I'm pointing at. So I want to see if I can pull this out and make it clear on its own. The need for this move to be a reliable thing in the background that we can point at for not just the easy cases and not just understanding in abstract what this move is, but to apply it in the challenging cases. I think that's part of what's going on in this philosophical discussion. The reason that philosophy has this sophistry tone to it. I laugh because the word sophistry comes from the sophists who were part of the heritage that we have for Western philosophy. But the reason philosophy has this kind of tone of like, oh, this is abstract and this is complicated and all these fancy thoughts and it probably doesn't matter. The reason for that is because of a type of abstracting move that in fact doesn't make sense. That's very common when we try to talk about very abstract topics. It doesn't have to be that way. All of these discussions, like, well, what about scientific materialism? Do we agree with that? Of course, that's the preferred perspective. But what about the relationship with consciousness? Is the hard problem of consciousness a real problem? Blah, blah, blah. The reason they're abstract for some people is because they aren't grounded in truth. What is the relationship to the truth that matters? How does that affect how I talk to people that I love? How does it reflect on what I do when I feel anxiety? What does it mean makes a fulfilling life? How do I cultivate happiness and wisdom? How do I deal with depression? These are very practical questions for some people. Like, each one of these is going to be practical in some case. And if our way of relating to truth and to ideas doesn't ground in what matters, then it doesn't matter. So I want to talk about that here. I mean, I don't want to talk about it in just this abstract philosophical sense. I want to talk about it in terms of a very practical move of consciousness. And it's essential for being able to even hear questions as they're intended. So there is a tradition for this. I don't claim to be an heir of this tradition. I've just sort of watched it from the sidelines. I've interacted with some people who are, in fact, heirs of this tradition. One of them in particular, I think if he were to see what I'm about to say about his own tradition, he might look at it and go, oh, Michael, you're missing the point. So bear in mind, I'm going to borrow from a tradition because there's a concept in it that is present and valuable there that, as far as I know, I haven't identified any place in the West that there's any kind of commonality of recognition of this. So in Rinzai Zen, there is this concept of a koan. So koans, this is where you get the stuff about what is the sound of one hand clapping. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Although these are mockeries of actual koans. They are, in an important way, they are not real koans. And the purpose of a koan in Zen training, this is a kind of enlightenment training, mindfulness training, is that these are questions or puzzles that the act of contemplating them is meant to help strengthen the right kinds of sort of experiential muscles to encourage a sudden awakening. When you suddenly get the answer to the question, you awaken. Approximately speaking. I'm simplifying a lot. The idea is that only awakened beings can correctly answer koans. So trying to answer a koan should help push you to sudden awakening. So later I'll give some actual example. Well, let me give you one quick example. An actual example of a koan is, all right, so we talk about awakening. Who is it that awakens? So there's like trying to answer that question. Oh, if I become awake, who is it that awakens? Who am I that is asleep? Who am I that becomes awake? So I'll explore what it means to approach a question like that. But I want to emphasize in what I have to say in what follows. This is me doing jazz with this concept. I don't claim to be fully honoring the original context. So the puzzle is that when answering anything koan-like, there are two kinds of directions that you can go in. One is to try to intellectually answer the question. And another, so I don't quite remember the phrasing and its translation from Japanese, so I don't know. But the thing about what is the sound of one hand clapping, the original koan sounds a lot more like, you know what the sound of two hands clapping is. What is the sound of no hand clapping? Now, there's a way to analyze this puzzle and go, what do you mean, what is the sound? Like, define what you mean by sound. What do you mean by clapping? Is that even a well-defined term, or are you just putting words together? There's a way to analyze it and then break it apart, saying, look, this question doesn't mean anything. That's going up into the mind. Now, I'll be much more clear about this in a moment, what I mean by up into the mind. But one way to answer the question by going down into experience. These are the two directions I want to emphasize, going up into the mind and going down into experience. When you go down into experience, down into the ground of truth, and you ask, well, what is the sound of no hands clapping? Eckhart Tolle talks about the answer to this question. I don't know if he ever mentions this koan. I honestly don't remember. It's been a long time since I've read his books. And he references this business of, we look around and we see objects, but we often don't see the space that holds the objects. The space is eternal. The space is there. It's what makes the objects possible, but we fixate on the objects. The same thing is true of sounds. When you listen, the way most of us listen is listening for a sensation. Right? I can hear the slight vent, the slight sound of the vent airing some warm air in here. I can occasionally hear people throughout the rest of the house doing little movements. Sometimes I hear my cat meow. But what am I listening to when I hear nothing? Well, I hear the same thing that I am hearing when I hear something. I'm just not noticing it. I'm not paying attention to the nothing that holds the context for something to be experienced. So answering that koan is a matter of recognizing the sound of nothing that is the sound of no hands clapping. You can say one hand clapping, it doesn't matter. The point is that there's this silence. There is always silence. Even when there is sound, there is silence. You might get nitpicky about, oh, like this is screwing with the definition of silence, but the point of this is that I'm not trying to describe a thought. I am using words to point at an experience. But this distinction, going up into thought and down into experience, this is the key distinction. I think it's very valuable to have a clear thought about, but to be able to use the thought to refer to experience about this. So let me give you some clearer examples. What do your feet feel like right now? And so noting that, just asking the question, there's a tendency for the mind to go down into the experience. You can't answer that by going, well, how would my feet be feeling? Well, the room is kind of cool. So I remember seeing this temperature before, and like that doesn't make sense to answer the question. There's a little bit of distance in once I go down, then having to articulate it, and then I'm focused on how to describe it. But even to do that, there's some degree of contact with, oh, my feet feel a little bit cool right now. I'm wearing shoes, so I can feel the wrapping of the shoes. There's a little feeling of constriction, just a little bit. And specifically the toes are cool. And there's a very slight sensation of kind of aching on the bottom of the right heel. So to answer to say that, I have to be in touch with the experience. That's going down into the experience. So let me modify the question now. How do you experience your feet? Now there's an invitation. There's actually a clear choice point. If you go up into the mind, what that can look like for me, how do I experience my feet? Well, there's this process where I have neurons in the feet, and those neurons provide sort of a neural impulse that goes up my legs, up into my spine, that goes to my brain, and my brain does some kind of processing, and I don't know exactly how the details work in there. Right, that's one way to go. Another way that is still up in the mind is to go, well, I guess, and then here I'm creating a picture of myself and imagining, here's this image of me sort of looking down at like where I'm sitting, and in that sitting position, I'm then having my head look at my feet and going, well, how does this happen? Well, I think there's this kind of attention thing that moves down into the feet. And how does that happen? Well, I don't know. I don't know how the direction works here, but it does. It's some kind of thing happens. Okay. Those are models, and that's going up into the mind. There's a different way to answer that question. How do I feel my feet? By what method do I feel my feet? What I do instead is I feel my feet. And I look, the same way I'm looking at my feet, I look at how I'm looking. I might not know how to articulate the answer, but I am answering the question, at least to myself. How do I feel my feet? It's like answering the question, what color is the back of my hand? I could answer, oh, it's some kind of pinkish color, or I can look. And that's the difference between going up into the mind and going down into experience. In most cases that are very mechanical, physical, this is actually very straightforward. It gets trickier when we create a little distance from immediate sensation, but it's important to track that this is a clear difference. There's a clear difference between going up and going down. That difference is one that you can come to experience and understand. If you understand this difference as a mental model and you try to shove it into the mind, that's an important component, but if that's all you do, you may get confused about what I'm talking about. And so there's a way that I do this. I find value in this. I use Ian McGilchrist's model of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. That model suggests that basically what I'm talking about is what I'm calling up is into the left hemisphere, and what I'm calling down is into the right hemisphere. Everything is oversimplified whenever anyone talks about the brain and how the brain works and what regions of the brain do. But I can look at it in that way and go, oh, well, this is the left hemisphere. Like going up is about going into the left hemisphere, and going down is going into the right hemisphere. In terms of priority, that makes sense to me. In fact, you can even see the relationship between why going up without having the anchoring in the down is going to create some problems. But doing that is creating the mental model and interacting with the mental model. Much more critical is the ability to experience the difference between going up and going down. This is going down about this difference about going up and going down. It can be a little bit heady, but try not going into the head. If you feel, if you embody what I am talking about, it is immensely obvious. It might be a little slippery, but it's like the difference between, like I used to teach martial arts. I'm trying to get people to understand when somebody is grabbing you, you can do a rotational movement. So how do you do that rotational movement? Well, you rotate your hand. Or you can rotate in either direction, it doesn't matter. I mean, being able to create some sort of twist to be able to create a joint lock to break out of the grip. Now, if we get stuck talking about philosophy about this, well, but what if they're stronger than me? And well, what exactly is the angle that you're doing this at? And how much force should I apply? And like, how do I do this? We're going to be stuck in talk land forever. The actual answer to the question, how do I do this, is to grab their wrist and have them try. Experiential, grounded in the body, this moment. What is the actual lived experience right now? That's how you answer koans. Again, I don't know if Zen masters would agree with me, but I'm borrowing the concept to say there is a true thing I am pointing at. What I'm doing right now is grounding in the down. There's one way to think about this is that the body is the sense organ for truth. A different way of saying that is that the body is in reality. It is possible to have thoughts that are false, thoughts that are disconnected from reality. Like I can imagine a purple elephant floating over my head. But when I look, I don't see one. So what is it that gives me the grounding in truth, in what is real? It's not more thought. It's this, here. The direct experience, the physicality, the material body. The material body is what matters. That's not just wordplay. There's a historical reason those words mean the same thing. Material and maternal actually have the same etymological root, same root as matter, which is both matter as in physical matter and matter as in it matters. The reason all of those have the same collection is because it's rooted in the mother, in the maternal, in the origin of physicality. I think this is a historical reference to Mother Earth. I'm not entirely sure, but if that's false, it is still a useful thought. It helps to ground my thoughts. It helps my thoughts to notice, oh, here. Sometimes you'll see me just pausing, staring at the camera or closing my eyes, taking a breath. What I'm doing is anchoring in the physical. Because I can't go into thought and do anything that matters if I don't have roots from the thoughts into the material. So I need to check what's down before I get lost in what's up. It's a huge recurring practice for me. It's absolutely central. It's like the basic movement over and over again, how to make thoughts matter. Okay. So, the reason this lived distinction is so important is that, well, for example, I had a friend who pointed out when I was highlighting this distinction, he noted, oh yeah, and schools sort of train people to abandon their own lived experience in order to answer the question. Like even though you're a body, like as a child, you're a body, interacting with other bodies, you have to sit still even when that isn't what your body wants to do. And you're being asked questions with informational content. And in order to avoid difficulty, you need to find a way to verbally answer the question. So you have to figure out what to do. So there's this pressure to go up. There's a reason for this. There's an evolutionary reason for this, but the evolution type is not biological primarily. It's mimetic. It's about the evolution of behaviors and behavioral systems. I don't want to get into that too much here. I just want to note there's a cause for this. It makes sense. There's a reason schools do it. And we have it within range as a species to decide that we're done doing that. It requires mastering this move, recognizing the difference between what I'm calling up and down. So in schools, there will be this whole business of, all right, so like, how do you know, like, I didn't go to school, so it's like, what's a good example? I'm pulling up stereotypes. But if you look at something like, where is Paris? I've used this example a lot. I'm going to keep grabbing this one. My girlfriend is near Paris, so this is an alive question for me. You're keeping track of, well, where is she? How are we related? How are we relating emotionally, but also physically? We're physically apart, so, but what does that mean? She's somewhere else? She's away? I have a whole video on away, right? And an essay. So when I think of Paris, well, where is Paris? When I ask you that question, where is Paris? Notice what happens. Now, you might brush the question aside. That's a refusal to answer. That's fine. That doesn't give you a chance to see the up or down directions. If you go, whatever, I'm just going to listen to what he has to say. Perfectly fine. It just means that you won't have an internal experience to check what I'm saying against. If you answer, oh, well, Paris is in France. It's over in Europe. And maybe you get a picture of Europe. For me, I get a picture of, okay, well, there's this picture of, here is like Europe. Europe is approximately a wiggly rectangle. And over here is the blob that is France. And it's got this coastline across here, and Paris is roughly over here. Right? That's basically how my visual comes up with it. Just pop visual. And they're going to answer, Paris is right there. So that's going up. Because here's a simple check. When that happens, do you see where your eyes are pointing? Do you see what it is that your eyes are pointed at? So here, when I turn around and I go, well, here is the rectangle and here's what's going on. The default thing that happens from my experience is that I see the rectangle, even though my eyes are pointed over here. Actually, like I've got a shirt hanging up here. It's waiting to be repaired. And that shirt up there, even though my eyes are pointed at it, when I guide my eyes to the right-hand side of this rectangle, I don't see the shirt because I'm too busy seeing my fuzzy map of Europe. So that means that my mind is creating an illusion that is not true about my physical environment. That doesn't make it useless, but it's not true. It's not true that Paris is right here. Right? So it's really important to be able to track that difference. So one way of going down, ask, where is Paris? So if I haven't done work to marry the above and below, the fusion of heaven and earth, and I have done a bunch of this work in this specific instance, but if I don't do that work, the honest answer is I don't know. I know Paris is in France, which is in Europe, and it corresponds to these mental images that come up. But if I'm honest about my experience, I don't know what that means unless I do some grounded work. So that's up and down split. That's them unconnected. But there is an act of connecting them that I can do, and in this case I have done, which is I can take some of these models like, well, like the essential question is, how does it compare to where my body is? Now, I won't go through the details of this. It's actually a little bit of tricky geometry. A friend of mine and I, both of whom have a, like I think he got his bachelor's degree in engineering, if I remember right. My master's degree is mathematics, and we still had a hard time working this out because it turns out the geometry is a little tricky. But the short answer is, uh, looking at the globe, it turns out that Paris is straight east. Like you look at a globe, here is me, over here is Paris, just all basically right along one of the east-west lines, longitudinal lines. I get longitude and latitude backwards because the lines go one way but measure the other. Anyway, so one of the ones that wrap around the Earth, it's on the same one of those. And that's east. But it turns out Paris is not that way because of the curvature of the Earth. And because of complicated stuff, it actually turns out that Paris is through the ground at a little less than 45 degrees to the northeast. Now, if you get caught going up and you haven't done this work, like this is real work. This is the work of knowing. The Greeks called this work the art of knowing. Right? It's just that what the Greeks called that, and the practices that we've inherited from them for doing this art have now transformed entirely into a mental computational practice. Their word for knowing was mathema, same as polymath, mathema, and the practitioner of the art of knowing was a mathematikos. Is where we get our language for mathematics from. But we don't teach mathematics anymore. No one has ever taught mathematics to a first approximation. Certainly nobody in public school. They're taught computation. They're taught here is an algorithm, now apply the algorithm, for the most part. I've been out of touch with what exactly public education is doing for a number of years. My PhD was in math education, but that was, I graduated in 2012. So it's been 8 years, and things might have changed a bit. But I have reason to think, just a priori, I would expect it not to have changed that much. So the important part is that taking these models and rooting them in the experience of physicality of my body, in the present moment, in the present location, I now know Paris is that way. It just so happens that exactly the angle is almost exactly the way that my wall over here is faced, so it's very easy for me to remember. And the angle is such that I'm basically pointing at, from this position of sitting, I'm pointing at the bottom corner of the room where the carpet meets the wall. So it's very easy, like I had to do all the mathematics to check, but once I got that way is Paris, and the curvature of the Earth is such that it's going to be down, so I have this orientation. In doing that, I know where my girlfriend is, but I know that I do not have a felt sense of how far in that direction she is. Far away, but I have a hard time having a physically felt sense of distances beyond a few hundred feet. It's getting a little bit better. I think actually at this point, to be honest, I think I've got it at a few thousand feet. I have a lived sense from having done a lot of walks, including on high terrain where I can see my walking path, so my body knows what it feels like to walk through those areas and how far those distances are, and I can compare it to a map. So I now have built up a range where, at least in certain areas, I know what a couple of miles feel like. But this is thousands of miles. I know the words, I know the math, I can go up in order to answer the question correctly, which is to say I can keep the thoughts consistent. But I don't know the truth of it. I just know I can trust something about the abstraction. So being able to distinguish between what I know is true and what I am extrapolating with thought. This can be very tricky. In this case, I'm giving very clear distinctions. This is, in a very important sense, the foundation of empirical science. Science is the recognition that we can, among a bunch of other things, but the essence of science is the recognition that we can marry truth and extrapolation, but that it's necessary to do the check. You can't just say, well, here is the logic, I have now extended it and now I know. The question is, does every part of this ground in truth? The way that gets expressed now is, well, that's a nice theory. Does it match experiment? Does experimental data corroborate? But this, if that doesn't feel real as to what science is, then it doesn't matter. That's an abstraction. This is the truth of relating understanding, mental understanding, to reality. So the reason this is such a key move is, for one thing, because of the effect of school. There's a tendency to go up without going down. Does the Earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the Earth? Ah, you know the answer to that one, but what does that matter? How does that ground in the physicality? If you are watching the sunrise, how real is it as a felt experience that at the moment of sunrise, like you imagine, like because the sun isn't actually rising, it's actually that the Earth is rotating. So if you're standing here, what's happening at sunrise is that you are just getting high enough. You're basically on top of the world. You're seeing as the Earth is rotating, getting just the angle needed to see the sun. So what that means is when you are watching the sunrise, you are hurtling straight at the sun at the speed that the Earth is spinning. Those are thoughts. Does it feel real in that moment? You can't answer that question by going down right now, because unless you happen to be at exactly the right point on Earth right now and are listening to this at that point right now, you are almost certainly not watching the sunrise. So even this as a thought experiment requires going into the mind. What's real here and now? So most of what I'm doing right now is feeding the mind, giving the mind a tool, but there's a different direction to go in. This. And this is the ground. So when we answer questions like, so I'm going to go back to that first koan I gave an example of. Who is it that awakens? A slightly different version of the question is, who are you? This one I think is maybe a little clearer. Who are you? There are two directions to go in. You can go up into thought. Oh, who am I? Well, I'm Michael Smith, and I used to be a math teacher in university, and I did a bunch of work trying to fix that, and I built a company, and when I left that, I've been doing a lot of meditation. I don't really know what I do now, but I'm starting to figure it out. So this is kind of bumbliness to that, because when the question that I'm actually answering at that moment is not, who am I? I'm answering the question, what does my mind tell me when I ask my mind, who am I? It starts giving me a name, it starts giving me a history, it gives me some attempt to describe what it is that I do. Oh, well, I guess I am the experiencing being at the center of all this, because I happen to know some answers. I have some models in the mind for answering these questions, and that's still going up. This is just like the situation with, how do you feel your feet? How is it that you are able to feel your feet? What do you do? It's very, very similar. If you go up into answering the question, who are you? That is the same thing as answering the different question. And the question that you're answering is, what does my mind tell me when I ask this question? It's a different question entirely. It can be a valuable question, but it's not the first one to answer. It's much more important to be able to go down. Who are you? Now, if you try to look, you might get a little confused. That's okay. What that means is, like, if that happens, if you go, Because at least you have a spatial direction to look for your feet, but where do you look for you? Who is looking for you? You are looking for yourself? Where do you look? Do you look in your own head? But not in thought. What does that even mean? Cool. If that's where you are, then the truth is you don't know. That's a wonderful place to start. One way to learn is to look. Who are you? Can you listen to the sound of no hands clapping and just look? Who are you? You might not be able to articulate it. There's this issue of the marriage of heaven and earth. This business of you go up and go down separately. Ideally, you root in the down so that what is up has a place to be grounded, so it has a place to matter. You go down first, and then from the truth, you articulate the truth, and that answers the question in the mind. This is how the marriage works naturally. It's how the fusion of left and right hemispheres works. You start with the grounding, the truth of the right hemisphere. Then you zoom in on some detail using the left, and then the left hand's control back to the right to check, is this right? Is this enough? If the stuff about the brain hemispheres doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. The model is infinitely less important in the present moment than is the direct experience of now. This is how, in my opinion, you answer koans. And again, I don't mean to make claims about the Zen tradition. I mean, in terms of the work that I do, the work that I see is valuable. What is important for me in my own personal work, and what I would like to invite others who resonate with what I am sharing to do. This is a foundational piece, answering koans. But I don't mean sit and stare at a wall and meditate for hours. This is actually very simple. It's a very simple movement. Another koan in this sense is, what do you want right now? That one's very slippery. I get caught by this one all the time. What do I want right now? Well, and then what I'll do is I will mentally, I'll go up. If I'm not careful, if I'm not watching, I will go up. And think of a model of me. I'll take in some sensations, like some body sensations of like my hips feeling a certain way, my tummy feeling a certain kind of way. But then I'll mentally go through, what are things I tend to like? What do I want of those? But that doesn't answer the question. That's answering the question, if I ask my mind what I want, what does my mind answer? That wasn't the question. The question is, what do I want? After enacting that, I can notice, I wanted a breath. I want a few moments of stillness. I want to share what I'm experiencing. But each time I speak, notice that I am describing what just happened. It's hard to say what is happening. The mind is often a step behind. It's necessary. It's actually useful. So more things are koans in the sense that I'm using the term, since I'm probably abusing the term. But, more things are koans than we tend to acknowledge. What matters in your life? Do you realize you are going to die someday? What do you want to do after you finish watching this video? There's a very grounded way of approaching all of these things. This is not abandoning the mind at all. It's about recognizing that the mind needs to root in something. So before you can know how to use your mind, before your mind can know how it can be used, how it can be of service, you need to be very clear about the distinction between going down into experience and going up into the mind. It is helpful for the mind to have this distinction, but you need the distinction. You need to notice. In order to use the mind's reflection of that distinction, you need the marriage of heaven and earth. When that happens, when you live the difference between answering koans and thinking thoughts, then it's possible to reorganize the mind so that it is of service to the embodied manifestation of who you are. If you don't do that, then your mind is going to keep getting in the way. And you won't notice because you'll be listening to the mind. This is the basic problem of the Western world right now. When I say Western, there's almost a historical context, basically of the world, in the sense of the West went and colonized everything and has westernized almost every culture, so anything that is connected by the internet, which is generally what's going to be observing this video, is for the most part westernized, with various exceptions, certainly the Anglophonic world. So I'm just noticing in each moment, which way are you going? Can you tell? I want to make a sort of footnote to this. I feel complete about what I wanted to say there, but for those who may be wondering about the scientific reductionist materialism, what all that is about, I'll try to give the very short version here. This is coming from a bit of history that I'm not going to go into, but in broad strokes, I see that there's an issue that the West has inherited that largely comes from the fact that the closest thing we have to a coherent paradigm is the scientific materialist paradigm. It's the closest thing. We don't, different people believe in, like some people believe in much more spiritual frameworks, various kinds of Christianity or some sort of yogic philosophy or whatever, animistic, neo-pagan. There's all kinds of different perspectives, but there's no unifying framework. There's a sense of, there is no coherent sense of what is real in culture. But the closest we have is the scientific claim of it's all matter, it operates by mechanical laws. And this provides a kind of dark context, because that worldview is fantastic for building tools, and it is utterly awful for explaining anything about meaningful experiences. It can describe the mechanics of meaningful experiences, but it can't describe meaning. This is the hard problem of consciousness. Now, if that feels like it's pushing up into your head, don't worry about that. This is the matter of grounding in what even is real. Is this cup real? The point that I would want to make is, if instead of answering that question, is this cup real, by going up into the mind, you answer the question by going down into experience, the answer is obviously yes. And thus I dispute it. So the challenge that I would give to the materialist paradigm is not an intellectual one. It's not an analytic thing. I think as a tool set, it's wonderful. I use it tremendously. I do not claim it is wrong. Wrong according to what framework? from what perspective. The challenge I give is not to the framework, but to how it is used. There is a claim, there is a sort of implicit claim that it has the right and authority to claim what is true. The truth is that this is made of atoms, right? And the atoms have this kind of interlocking pattern, and we know this because science has gone through and investigated and blah, blah, blah. Notice the quality that is like, Paris is in France, which is in Europe, which is kind of to the east of the United States over an ocean, blah, blah, blah. What truth means when you're up in the mind is very swimmy and complicated. This literally drove people insane a century ago trying to sort this out, a little over a century ago, turn of the 20th century. But my experience of this is not made of atoms. How do I know? There is some explanatory power, an enormous amount of explanatory power that comes from imposing a model of atoms and structuring that in order to make predictions. I don't deny that at all. It's a beautiful tool set, immensely powerful tool set. That tool set has a strange implication. It implies that I don't experience. That's the hard problem of consciousness. There's no room for experience within the model. There's debate about this. Oh no, it doesn't say that. Consciousness is actually an illusion. What would an illusion to whom? Right. I have a very clear stance on this. And that clarity is coming from the fact that what I'm talking about, the reason for going down is that that's where your sense of truth is. How do you know you can feel your tongue in your mouth? You answer that question not by going into thought, but by looking at your experience of your tongue. That is how you know you feel your tongue in your mouth. That's not wordplay, that's the ground of truth. Explaining the ground of truth from within a model just says that the model doesn't contradict your experience of truth. That's all it says. It does not say that it has correctly, that doesn't allow you to conclude that it correctly describes something that is more basic than your sense of truth. Because how do you know that that's what the model says? That's a consistency check, not a truth check. So my objection to scientific materialism is not the worldview. I think the worldview is fine. My objection to it is the claim that the worldview is correct. I'm not saying it's incorrect. I'm saying it is literally impossible to know. So what's with the claim? The origin of making that claim cannot be because it's true. The origin of the claim is because of a divorce from looking at the ground of truth. And to the extent that there is a determination to believe in this kind of materialism, that, oh, well, ultimately it's all just reductionist materialist. Like that's the reality, and we build everything off of that. We don't know how to bring everything down to there, but that's a matter of time and discovery, and maybe we can't figure it all out, but it's true. The cause of that attitude can't be a preference for truth, because if that were so, we wouldn't be making this assertion without having it grounded in the sense of truth. So that means that the energy behind the insistence that that paradigm is correct is one that doesn't want to look at the truth. That attitude makes the use of the scientific paradigm untrustworthy. Not wrong, just untrustworthy. What's it doing? It's preferring something other than reality. So, if that last part made no sense to you, don't worry about it. Much, much more important to be able to distinguish between up and down, between the mind and experience. You can do that. Everything else I have to point at is going to be a lot easier, a lot easier to track. And just this one distinction, I think, opens up huge gateways of freedom and ease. When I talk about what is intention, what does it mean to choose, part of how I answered that question was by going down. And when I got it, and I realized, oh, the question is actually the answer to itself when I go down into it. Right, it has to be. There's some mental complexity about that, having to do with the marriage of heaven and earth again. But it's clarity. It's absolute clarity, grounded in truth. So if you get that, everything else I have to say is going to be a lot more straightforward and a lot more meaningful. So this is how to ground things in meaning. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks for listening.